I'm Claire Whitmore, 28 years old, and the day I walked into that will reading, I could already tell it wasn't about grief. My parents sat forward like gamblers at a table, eyes fixed on the lawyer, as if the right words might unlock a treasure. Across from them, my brother Ryan tapped his pen, pretending not to notice their anticipation. I wasn't surprised I'd seen that look all my life, the same one that appeared every time he walked into a room, and I somehow vanished. What I didn't know as I took my seat at that polished oak table was that someone else in that room had been quietly waiting to speak, and her words would change everything I thought I knew about family. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to fight for the recognition you deserved. I grew up in a house that looked perfect, from the sidewalk, white shutters, trimmed hedges, a flag flapping on the porch. Inside, perfection meant comparison. My father Robert believed in hierarchy. The louder voice wins, the son leads, the daughter endures. My mother Diane floated between hostess smiles and silent judgments, always ready to defend Ryan's latest potential. And then there was me, the child who did everything right and somehow still felt wrong. When I brought home report cards lined with A's, my father would nod and say, "That's expected, Claire." When Ryan scraped by with B's, there were pizza nights and proud photos posted for the world to see. I learned early that effort didn't matter unless it shined on their chosen favorite. On my 10th birthday, I got a homemade cake and a pat on the shoulder. That same summer, Ryan turned 7 and celebrated with a backyard carnival pony rides a magician and all our neighbors cheering. I remember standing by the kitchen window watching the glow of string lights, wondering what it would feel like to be looked at with that kind of joy. By high school, the pattern was set in stone. I studied late, joined every club that would take me, and won scholarships they barely mentioned. Ryan crashed his first car at 17, and my father replaced it before the month was over. When I left for college, I did it alone. I loaded my used sedan with everything I owned and promised myself I wouldn't ask for help. While Ryan took a gap year to figure things out, I juggled 2 part-time jobs and a double major. My father wired him money every month, $1,200 for living expenses. When I asked for a small loan for textbooks, I got, "You're responsible, Claire. You'll manage." And I did. I learned to budget down to the penny, to skip meals when rent came due, to celebrate victories quietly, because no one was listening anyway. I graduated debt-free and took a job at a mid-sized financial firm, working my way up to lead designer by 26. I bought a 1-bedroom condo with my savings, proud that every inch of it was mine. When I invited my parents to see it, they smiled politely and said, "It's nice you've always been self-sufficient." That word self-sufficient had become their way of saying, "We don't need to show up for you." I laughed it off, but that night I sat on the floor of my living room surrounded by boxes, realizing I'd built an entire life without their presence and somehow still longed for their approval. Ryan stayed home. He drifted between startups, convinced he was one idea away from greatness. My parents called it entrepreneurial spirit. They bragged about his projects even when none of them made it past the prototype stage. Meanwhile, I got promoted, traveled for conferences, built a steady career, and stopped sharing my achievements altogether. Every time I tried, my mother changed the subject. Every time I called my father, asked if I'd heard from Ryan. Eventually, silence felt easier than trying. The one person who never treated me like background noise was my grandfather, Henry. He sent me handwritten cards every birthday, sometimes just a single line. "Keep your head up, kid." The quiet ones build the strongest foundations. When he passed away, something in me went still. At the funeral, my parents sat shoulder to shoulder with Ryan, their hands resting on his back as if they were the ones who'd lost the most. I sat a row behind alone. After the service, my grandmother Eleanor pressed a tissue into my hand and whispered, "He was proud of you, dear. Don't forget that." I held on to those words like they were the last thread of truth left in that family. 2 weeks later, a letter from the lawyer arrived, summoning all of us to the reading of Henry's will. I didn't expect much, maybe a keepsake, a gesture, but I went, because Grandma had written a separate note, her careful script steady and deliberate. "Your grandfather made sure of something. Please come." That was all. No explanation, just a feeling that I was meant to be there. When the day came, I took the morning off work and drove downtown in my best blazer. The air in the office smelled faintly of old books and cedar polish. My parents were already seated, their expressions calm but expectant. Ryan greeted me with a nod, half-smile, the kind you give someone you haven't called in months. I sat across from them, folded my hands, and told myself to breathe. The lawyer began with the usual formalities, divisions, documents, signatures. Then he read the section about the grandchildren. My name came first, followed by the words, equal share. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd misheard. My father leaned forward, interrupting smoothly. "We'll be accepting Claire's portion on her behalf," he said. "She's not concerned with these things." My mother smiled, serene as ever. Ryan's eyes dropped to the table. For a second the room froze, the air thick with polite horror. I opened my mouth ready to object, but a quiet voice reached me first. My grandmother's, calm, unwavering. "I think we should all hear the rest of the will before anyone speaks." Her tone silenced the room. Even the lawyer hesitated before continuing. My heart pounded as the words blurred together, but one thing was certain: the balance of power had just shifted, and for once I wasn't the one shrinking into silence. When my grandmother spoke, her voice carried more weight than the lawyer's entire stack of papers. Every eye turned toward her, and even my father leaned back slightly, caught off guard. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and continued reading as instructed. My pulse thudded in my ears. The words seemed to stretch forever, winding through legal language, until he reached the section naming the grandchildren again, Ryan and me. He read my full name, Claire Marie Whitmore, and confirmed I was entitled to an equal share. It should have been a moment of quiet fairness, but instead I felt my father's glare burn through me like I'd stolen something. He laughed under his breath, the sound dry and sharp. "Let's be reasonable," he said, turning toward the lawyer. "Claire's doing well for herself, career condo, no debt. Ryan is still building his future. Dad would have wanted the money to go where it could actually grow." My mother nodded beside him, her tone gentle but heavy with condescension. "Claire has always been independent. She doesn't care about material things. I'm sure she wouldn't mind helping her brother." I stared down at my folded hands, every instinct telling me to keep quiet the way I'd been trained to. But something in me refused this time. "I don't need anyone to accept anything on my behalf," I said, my voice low but steady. My father turned to me with a look that used to stop me cold as a child. "This isn't about you," he said slowly. "It's about family, about doing what's right." My mother added softly, "Don't let pride cloud your judgment, sweetheart." The lawyer looked uneasy, glancing between us. "Legally," he said, "unless Claire signs a waiver or power of attorney, the inheritance belongs solely to her." My father's jaw flexed. For a second I thought he might slam a fist on the table, but instead he smiled in that polite, dangerous way he reserved for moments when he wanted to humiliate me. "We'll see about that." He began listing every expense they'd ever covered for me. Braces, clothes, 1 semester of textbooks, the roof over my head. "You owe us, Claire. Don't forget who raised you." My mother's voice followed, sweet as honey and just as sticky. "If you loved us, you'd do what's right for the family." I opened my mouth, but no words came. Then I felt a hand on mine, my grandmother's. She didn't say much, only leaned in close and whispered, "You don't owe them anything, dear, and your grandfather knew that." I turned toward her, blinking hard, and in that small moment I felt years of silence crack open. When the reading ended, my parents stood abruptly, muttering about needing air. Ryan hesitated, then followed them out, his head low. I stayed seated long after everyone else had gone, staring at the polished wood of the lawyer's desk. My name still echoed in my mind, like a word I didn't recognize. Claire Marie Whitmore, entitled to 1 equal share. Simple. Fair. But in my family, fairness had always felt like a foreign language. By the time I got home that evening, my phone was buzzing. My mother first. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Was it worth it?" Then my father. "I hope you enjoy your blood money." I should have ignored them, but I kept reading, hoping for something softer. The final message came from Ryan. I didn't ask for any of this. That one stayed with me. I lay awake for hours, the glow of the city light spilling across my ceiling. My chest ached with an old kind of sadness, one that came from being blamed for simply existing differently. By dawn, I decided I needed distance. I emailed my manager for time off, packed a small bag, and turned off my phone. There was one place that had always felt untouched by their noise, my grandparents' cabin by the lake. When I was a little girl, Grandpa would take me there to fish at sunrise. Grandma would sneak me sugar cookies before dinner and tell me stories about growing up during the war, about what endurance really meant. I hadn't been back since college. The road curved through pine forests, the air getting clearer with every mile. When I arrived, the old cabin looked exactly the same, peeling paint, ivy climbing the porch rails, a wind chime still hanging from the eave. The door creaked when I opened it, and a wave of dust and memory swept over me. I set my bag down, started a small fire, and sat in silence. For the first time in years, I let the tears come. It wasn't just grief for Grandpa. It was everything: the birthdays forgotten, the phone calls ignored, the years spent chasing approval that never came. I cried until my throat hurt, until the fire burned down to embers. Then, exhausted, I wrapped myself in a blanket and fell asleep on the couch. Morning sunlight filled the room. I made coffee on the old stovetop, the smell instantly familiar. While unpacking, I found something in the nightstand drawer of the guest room, a sealed envelope with my name written in careful block letters. Claire. My heart skipped. I sat down, turned it over in my hands, and opened it. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. Grandpa's. If you're reading this, it means the will has been read. I imagine your parents are making things messy. I want you to know I saw everything. The way they overlooked you, the way they poured everything into Ryan and told you to be strong. You were never invisible to me. This inheritance isn't a favor, it's acknowledgement. You earned it every day you kept going, even when no one noticed. Your voice matters, Claire. Don't let anyone take it from you again. Love always, Grandpa. I pressed the letter against my chest and sat there for a long time, the cabin silent, except for the crackle of the fire. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about being seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. By afternoon, I packed up and drove back to the city. The letter felt heavy in my pocket like a shield. When I reached home, I called Grandma. She answered on the first ring, her voice steady. "Did you find the letter?" she asked. "I did," I said, trying not to cry again. "Thank you." She was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather wanted you to know something. Love can be quiet, but it should never be invisible. He saw you, dear. Always." I swallowed hard. "Grandma?" I whispered, "Did he know they'd try to take it?" She sighed softly. "He did more than know. He prepared for it." That was when she told me everything. Months before he passed, my parents had tried to convince him to change the will, arguing that Ryan needed more help and that I was already comfortable. They even pushed for Ryan to be the sole beneficiary among the grandchildren. But Grandpa refused. He and Grandma worked with the lawyer to add a clause. If anyone tried to alter or redirect the inheritance, their own share would be forfeited. It was written, notarized, and legally airtight. My parents had triggered it the moment they spoke at that table. The lawyer had already informed them, and their reaction had been exactly what Grandma expected: rage and disbelief. "They're furious," she said quietly, "but they can't undo it. Your grandfather made sure of that." I stood there, the phone warm against my ear, realizing what that meant. For once, someone had seen what was coming and taken my side before I even knew I'd need it. "They're saying you turned us against them," Grandma added gently. I gave a small, hollow laugh. "Of course they are." She didn't argue. Instead, she said, "We're removing your father as executor. The firm will oversee the estate from now on. It's what Henry wanted if things got ugly." I sat down hard on the couch, stunned. For so many years, I'd believed no one in that family would ever stand up for me, and now, even in death, Grandpa had done just that. When we hung up, I sat in silence, listening to the city traffic outside. Somewhere beneath the noise, a calm had started to settle in. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for the next blow. I was ready for it. That night, a knock echoed at my door. I opened it to find my parents standing there, faces, tight eyes, burning with accusation. My father's first words weren't hello. "You planned this," he said, voice sharp as glass. "You manipulated your grandmother, twisted your grandfather against us." My mother's mascara had smudged. Her voice trembled. "Don't do this, Claire. Just sign it over. Ryan needs this." I held my ground. "I needed a family for 28 years," I said quietly. "And I never got one." My father's mouth twisted into a cold smile. "Then I hope the money keeps you warm, because after this you don't have a family anymore." They turned and walked down the hall. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in my life, I didn't cry when they left. Because somewhere deep down, I understood I hadn't lost a family that night. I'd simply stopped pretending one existed. After my parents walked out that night, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than anything they had said. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky, wondering if this was what freedom sounded like, quiet, unfamiliar, and just a little frightening. Days passed without a single call or text. The same people who once filled my phone with guilt-laced messages now vanished completely. At first, the stillness felt strange, almost hollow, but gradually it began to settle into something like peace. Grandma called me every morning. Her voice carried the kind of calm that could steady anyone. She never asked me to explain or defend myself. She simply wanted to know if I was eating, sleeping, and remembering to breathe. Each conversation felt like a small reminder that family could exist without control or cruelty. I started to find comfort in small routines again, watering the plants, taking early walks, making quiet dinners for one. But just when I thought the storm had passed, a knock sounded on my door one afternoon. When I looked through the peephole, I froze. It was Ryan. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, eyes down, looking more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. For a few seconds, I didn't move. Then I opened the door. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. His voice carried none of the arrogance that used to echo in our parents' living room. I nodded and stepped aside. He didn't sit, just stood there in the middle of my living room, glancing around like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. "I didn't know they were going to do that," he said finally. "At the will reading, I didn't ask for any of it." I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. "But you didn't stop them either." My words weren't sharp, just honest. He flinched, nodding. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have." The silence that followed was long but not hostile. Then Ryan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. My stomach tightened when I saw the handwriting across it, Grandpa's strong and steady. "He wrote me one too," Ryan said. "Grandma gave it to me a few days ago." He opened it carefully like it might break if handled too fast. "It wasn't warm exactly," he said, looking down at the page. "But it was honest." His voice shook slightly as he read. He said he saw what our parents had done, that letting them shape me into their legacy had ruined any chance I had to be my own person. He looked up, his eyes raw. He told me to stop letting other people fight my battles, to grow up to apologize and to fix what I can. I didn't trust myself to speak yet. Ryan folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope before continuing. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said. "Not just for what happened with the inheritance, for everything. For not speaking up, for letting them push you aside while I coasted through life pretending not to notice." His voice broke on that last word. I watched him take a slow breath, steadying himself. It was easier to ignore it than to face them. But I knew. I always knew. We sat down, finally, across from each other on the couch. The words started to flow after that, quietly at first, then faster, as the years seemed to unwind. We talked about everything. The birthdays, where I stood in the background, the times I came home to silence while he was showered with praise, the small moments that had built a lifetime of imbalance. I told him about the science fair where I won first place and no one came. He told me about how our parents had turned every one of his failures into a lesson for me instead of him. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Being the favorite wasn't freedom, he said. It was pressure. Every mistake I made got covered up and I never learned to take a hit. I'm 25 and I've never earned anything on my own. I studied his face. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying an identity that didn't fit. "You built your life piece by piece," he said quietly. "I envy that. I think Grandpa did too." Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The air between us wasn't cold anymore, just heavy with truth. Then Ryan looked up, his voice firmer. "I'm going back to school," he said. I blinked. "What?" "With my part of the inheritance," he continued. "I'm enrolling in community college software design first, maybe finance later. I want to build something that's mine this time." For a moment I didn't know what to say. Then I smiled, just a small one. "I think Grandpa would be proud," I said. Ryan nodded. "I know he would." When he stood to leave, I followed him to the door. He hesitated, then reached out and hugged me. It wasn't stiff or awkward like before it was real. When the door closed behind him, I realized it was the first time in years I'd hugged my brother without feeling like I had to pretend. The days that followed were quiet, but different now. Ryan started calling once a week, sending updates about classes, small wins, and projects he was excited about. He even asked me to look over his first portfolio submission. Grandma called one evening, her voice warm with pride. "You two are finding your way," she said. "Your grandfather would be smiling right now." I glanced at Grandpa's letter on my desk. It had become my anchor. The ink was fading slightly from where my fingers brushed the paper too often, but the words still held their weight. "Your voice matters, Claire. Don't let anyone take it again." It had been nearly 6 months since the will reading. My parents still hadn't spoken to me, and according to Grandma, they'd cut Ryan off too. She said they blamed me for turning him against them. Ryan told me it hurt, but that he also felt lighter, like he could finally breathe. I understood that kind of freedom. I used part of my inheritance to start something new, a small mentorship fund for young women trying to find their footing in male-dominated fields. Girls who had been told, like I once was, to be strong but not too visible. I named it the Henry Fund after Grandpa. When I told Grandma, she cried softly and said, "You've turned his love into legacy." Therapy became part of my life again, though, this time not out of crisis, but choice. Healing wasn't simple. Some days I woke up still expecting disapproval that never came. Other days I caught myself smiling at nothing at all. I was learning to separate who I was from who I'd been told to be. Ryan kept his promise. He finished his first semester with straight A's and sent me screenshots of his grades with little messages like, "Guess I finally learned how to study." Sometimes I teased him. "So now you're the nerd in the family," and he'd laugh. It became our way of reclaiming something that once hurt. We started a new tradition, Sibling Sundays. Once a month we'd meet for breakfast or a walk in the park. No phones, no talk of our parents, just us. Sometimes we cooked pancakes at my apartment. Sometimes he'd bring over his laptop to show me his designs. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Grandma remained our anchor, calling every week to remind us we were rewriting what family meant. "Don't stop now," she'd say. "You two are proof that truth can heal." And she was right. Because somewhere between the fights, the silence, and the letters, something had shifted. I had stopped asking to be seen and started choosing to stand in the open. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined me. The girl who once stayed quiet to keep the peace was gone. And though the future still felt uncertain, one thing was clear this time: I wasn't going to disappear again. 6 months after the will reading, life began to settle into something that finally felt steady. My parents remained silent, their absence like a locked door I no longer tried to open. Ryan and I kept our promise to start fresh meeting every few weeks for what we called Sibling Sundays. Sometimes we made pancakes at my apartment. Sometimes we walked by the lake where Grandpa used to take us fishing. The quiet between us wasn't strained anymore. It was comfortable, like we were relearning how to exist without performance or expectation. Grandma became our steady link to the past, checking in on us every week. She had moved into a smaller house near the edge of town, filled with framed photos of the family as it once was before pride and favoritism had carved so much distance between us. One Saturday, Ryan and I drove down together to help her reorganize her attic. It was warm that day, the air thick with the smell of cedar and old paper. We opened boxes labeled in Grandpa's careful handwriting, tools, letters, fishing gear. There was something peaceful about touching pieces of his life again. In one of the boxes, I found a small wooden chest sealed with a tarnished brass latch. Inside were stacks of envelopes, all addressed in the same looping cursive letters Grandpa had written to Grandma during his early years in the Navy. She smiled when she saw them. "He used to write every week," she said softly, "even when he didn't know if I'd ever see him again." Ryan and I sat with her as she read one aloud. The words were plain and steady, filled with the same kindness that had always defined him. Later, as the sun dipped low, Grandma took my hand. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you're building," she said. "That fund you started, it's exactly what he hoped you'd do." I told her we'd already matched 3 girls with mentors, 2 of them studying design and finance like me. Ryan smiled and said he'd been helping one of the interns with coding exercises. It felt good sharing that with her, turning pain into something useful. But peace rarely lasted long where my parents were concerned. That night, after we got back to the city, an email from my father appeared in my inbox. The subject line was "Short Family Matters." My heart sank before I even opened it. The message was brief, almost clinical. He accused me of turning Ryan against the family and poisoning Grandma's mind. Then he mentioned something that made me pause. He was considering legal options to contest the inheritance clause. I stared at the words for a long time before closing my laptop. The next morning, I drove to Grandma's house. She wasn't surprised. "Your father came by yesterday," she said quietly. "He's angry, but his threats hold no weight. The documents are sealed. He can't touch them." She looked tired, though her normally calm eyes shadowed with worry. I told him he's welcome to come for dinner, but not to bring his arguments here. This house is for peace now. For a while I believed that would be the end of it. But a week later I got a call from the lawyer who had handled the estate. He sounded uneasy. "Claire, I received a request from your father's attorney to review the clause," he said. "They can't overturn it, but they're trying to challenge the executor transfer to your grandmother. It's unusual." I thanked him for the warning, though my stomach twisted. My parents hadn't just moved on, they were still trying to claw back control. When I told Ryan, he shook his head. "They'll never stop, will they?" I smiled faintly. "No. But we don't have to let them win." We met with the lawyer the next afternoon to discuss next steps. He assured us the clause was solid. "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing," he said. "It was drafted with multiple safeguards." Still, I left the office feeling a familiar heaviness, the same one that used to creep in whenever my parents found new ways to remind me that independence came with a price. That evening, Ryan came over with takeout and a laptop under his arm. "I have something for you," he said. He opened a file labeled Whitmore Archive. Inside were scanned photographs and recordings, old home videos he'd digitized from Grandma's attic. "I thought maybe we should preserve all of this before it disappears." We watched one clip together, Grandpa sitting at the lake with a young version of me teaching me how to bait a hook. His voice was steady and patient. "Don't rush," he said in the recording. "You'll feel when it's time." The screen flickered, and I saw myself nodding, my face sunburned, but proud. Ryan smiled. He always knew how to make things simple, he said. Something about that moment stirred a memory, how Grandpa would always say that truth didn't need to be loud to last. It was exactly how he'd lived, how he'd loved us, even when the rest of the family didn't notice. The next morning I printed the email from my father and tucked it into a folder with the legal documents. I wasn't afraid anymore, just resolved. The fight wasn't about money or power. Now it was about not letting them rewrite history again. Weeks passed before we heard any update. Then one evening Grandma called, sounding lighter. "It's over," she said. "The firm confirmed everything stands. The clause is intact and the court denied your father's motion outright." She paused, her tone softening. "He's furious, but maybe this will finally make him stop." When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment letting the news settle. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing alone. I felt surrounded by the memory of Grandpa's voice by Grandma's strength and by Ryan's quiet determination to start again. The next weekend, Ryan and I drove back to the lake cabin. We hadn't been there together since we were children. The air smelled of pine and old rain. The water was calm, the same blue-gray that used to reflect the sky when Grandpa cast his line. We rebuilt the small dock together, tightening bolts and sanding the weathered planks. It wasn't just maintenance, it felt like restoration. When we finished, Ryan sat beside me, his hands still dusty from the work. "You know," he said, "for a long time I thought being the favorite meant I was lucky. But I see now it made me blind." I looked at him, the wind brushing through the reeds. "We were both blind," I said, "just in different ways." He nodded, and for a long time we sat in silence watching the sun sink behind the trees. The world felt wider somehow, like there was finally room for both of us to exist. As evening fell, I walked to the porch and opened the letter Grandpa had written me one last time. The paper was creased, the ink fading slightly, but the words still glowed in the firelight. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone take it from you again. I folded it carefully and placed it back in my jacket. Then I turned to Ryan, who was lighting the lanterns by the dock. Let's head back soon, I said. Grandma's expecting us for dinner. He smiled, his expression calm and sure. Yeah, he said. Let's go home. That night, as we drove through the dark forest roads, headlights sweeping across the familiar path, I realized something had shifted for good. The legacy that once divided us had become the bridge that held us together. And though the fight wasn't entirely behind us, the fear was gone. For the first time, the road ahead felt clear, steady, and ours to build just as Grandpa always knew it would be. The morning after Ryan and I returned from the lake, I woke up before sunrise. The air in my apartment was cool, and still the city outside hushed beneath a gray sky. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of waiting for someone else's approval. I made coffee, opened the balcony door, and stood in the quiet, watching light spill over the rooftops. The world was the same, but something in me had shifted. Later that week, I met Grandma for lunch at a small cafe. She loved a corner place with creaky floors and strong coffee. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a folder beside her teacup. I have something for you, she said, patting the folder. From your grandfather's old files. I opened it and saw blueprints and letters marked Whitmore Annex Charleston. Grandpa's handwriting filled the margins, his notes meticulous and full of detail. Grandma explained that it was an unfinished project he had started years ago, a research annex he planned to donate to the state university before his health declined. He wanted you to have it, she said. He believed you'd know what to do with it. I didn't know what to say at first. The documents outlined a property with existing equipment and funding set aside waiting to be revived. I remembered Grandpa's quiet belief in building things that lasted. It's yours now, Grandma said. He made sure it transferred directly to you through the trust. Her voice softened. He said you'd turn it into something that helps others. I drove back home with the folder on the passenger seat, glancing at it during every stoplight. The papers felt heavier than they should have, not because of their weight, but because of what they meant. I spread them out on my kitchen table and began reading through each page carefully. By evening, I had made my decision. If Grandpa had left me a foundation to build on, I was going to do exactly that. The next few weeks passed in a blur of planning and phone calls. I took time off work, visited Charleston, and walked through the annex property for the first time. The building sat at the edge of a quiet road surrounded by oak trees. Dust clung to every window, and vines crept along the outer walls, but the structure itself was strong. I could almost feel Grandpa's presence there, his methodical touch in the layout, his vision in the details. Inside, the air smelled of paper and faint engine oil. Old drafting tables were lined up under covered windows, and scattered across them were sketches, test models, and sealed boxes marked prototypes. I stood there, hands on the cold metal railing, imagining what this space could become. That night, I called Ryan. I think I know what I'm supposed to do with it, I told him. I'm going to reopen the annex. But not just as a lab, I want it to be a research and mentorship center. There was a long pause, and then his voice brightened. You mean for students? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. For students, for young designers, anyone who needs a space to build and learn the way I never had growing up. Ryan offered to help with the technical setup, and Grandma insisted she would oversee the legal side until I was ready to take full control. Together, the three of us spent the next several months bringing the annex back to life. We hired local contractors, repainted the walls, installed new lighting, and rewired the workstations. I reached out to two of my old colleagues, Tara and Micah, both engineers I trusted completely, and they agreed to join me. They brought energy and expertise I didn't realize I needed. The day we reopened the building, sunlight poured through the windows, bouncing off the clean white walls. A small brass plaque by the entrance read, "The Whitmore Research Annex, in memory of Henry Whitmore." I traced the letters with my fingertips and felt a quiet rush of gratitude. As the weeks went on, the annex began to fill with life again. Students arrived from nearby colleges for internships. Young women from underrepresented fields joined mentorship programs. We held small workshops on design and sustainable development. Ryan set up a coding section for interactive prototypes, while Tara managed the fabrication lab. Every day the rooms buzzed with the sound of progress machines humming pens, scratching laughter echoing off concrete floors. But even as we built something new, I knew my parents hadn't let go of the past. I heard through Grandma that they'd been calling her often asking questions about the annex, trying to frame it as a family asset. One afternoon, an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. It was polite on the surface, full of feigned warmth, but I could read between the lines. She wanted to visit to see what I'd accomplished with the family's legacy. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I printed the email and placed it in a drawer with the others, a small archive of boundaries I refused to cross again. Still, I couldn't deny a lingering ache. I had spent so many years trying to prove I was worthy of belonging that cutting them off felt both freeing and hollow. Some nights I stood in the annex's main hall long after everyone had gone, listening to the quiet and thinking about how peace could feel both full and lonely at once. Then one afternoon, as we were hosting a workshop for local students, Grandma arrived unexpectedly. She stood in the doorway smiling as she watched a group of girls assemble circuit models with Ryan's guidance. When she walked over to me, her eyes glistened. "You've done it," she said. "You turned something meant to divide this family into something that builds." I hugged her, feeling the truth in her words. "It wasn't just me," I said. "You stood up for me when no one else did." Grandpa believed in me first. Ryan chose to change. We all had a hand in this. She nodded, her voice quiet. "That's the difference, Claire. You didn't seek revenge. You sought purpose." As evening fell, the students packed up and we stood outside together, watching the lights turn on across the property. The annex glowed softly against the twilight, a small testament to everything that had been reclaimed. I walked Grandma to her car, and before she left, she pressed a folded note into my hand. "From me to you," she said. "No lawyers involved this time." I opened it after she drove away. Inside was a single line written in her graceful cursive. "You are the continuation of everything we hoped this family could be." I read it twice before tucking it into my pocket. That night, Ryan and I locked up the annex and stood under the stars. "You think they'll ever come around?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "Maybe," I said. "But even if they don't, that's on them. We're not waiting anymore." He smiled faintly. "Good, because we've got work to do." We stayed there a while longer, just watching the lights reflect off the windows, the same windows that once stood dark and abandoned, now alive again. The future wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it felt steady beneath our feet. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. The annex would bring more attention than I ever expected, opening doors I hadn't imagined, and forcing me to face the family I thought I'd already left behind. A month after the annex opened, the quiet success we'd built started to draw attention. It began with a short feature in a regional business journal, nothing flashy, just a profile about community revitalization through research. I hadn't even known they were writing it until one of my interns showed me the article over lunch. By the end of that week, a few larger outlets reached out. They wanted to cover the story of a granddaughter restoring her grandfather's unfinished vision. The attention was sudden but surprisingly welcome. Every piece focused on the legacy of the annex and its purpose, not the inheritance drama that had birthed it. For the first time, my family's name was being attached to something built from care rather than conflict. Then 2 weeks later, I received an email from a national foundation requesting a meeting. They'd read about the annex's programs and wanted to discuss a partnership. I spent that night organizing the presentation slides, budgets, student testimonials, future projections. Ryan stayed up with me fixing formatting errors and joking that he felt like my assistant. We rehearsed until nearly midnight, our laughter filling the quiet hallways of the annex. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what could grow. The meeting took place on a gray Thursday morning. I stood in the main conference room with a panel of foundation representatives, professionals, who asked careful, deliberate questions. They wanted to understand how our mentorship program worked, how we ensured accessibility for students, and how the research side tied into local community development. I answered every question with calm precision, supported by Tara and Micah's data models and Ryan's interactive prototype. When the presentation ended, the room was quiet for a beat before one of them said, "This is the kind of initiative we want to support long-term." They offered a grant large enough to fund expansion, new labs, scholarships, and outreach programs. I accepted it with shaking hands, grateful beyond words. That night we held a small celebration. Grandma came carrying her usual tin of lemon cookies and hugged each of us in turn. "Your grandfather would be clapping the loudest," she said, with a smile that reached her eyes. "But success has a way of drawing out shadows you thought were gone." A few days after the news broke, my parents appeared again. It started with a voicemail from my mother, polite but distant. "We're proud of you," she said. "We'd love to stop by the annex sometime, see what you've done." I deleted the message without replying. Then came my father's email, less cordial. He wrote about family representation and proper legacy management, insisting the annex should bear the Whitmore family crest and naming him as an advisor. I forwarded the message to Grandma, who called within minutes. "Don't respond," she said firmly. "They're trying to attach themselves to something they once dismissed." I took her advice, but part of me still felt the sting. All those years they couldn't be bothered to attend a single showcase, and now they wanted to stand beside me for a photo op. That Sunday, as Ryan and I prepared for our mentorship workshop, he found me sitting alone in the office, staring at my inbox. "They reached out again, didn't they?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You don't owe them this, Claire." "I know," I said softly, "but I wish it didn't have to be like this." He exhaled slowly. "Maybe it does. They taught us what family shouldn't be. We're teaching ourselves what it can be." His words settled somewhere deep, quiet, but grounding. The following week, the foundation invited me to speak at a regional conference on innovation and leadership. It felt surreal, standing at that podium looking out at rows of people, students, business leaders, educators. I thought about how far the story had come from that tense will reading months earlier. My voice didn't shake this time. I spoke about building without bitterness, about legacy as something you choose to honor, not inherit. When I finished, the audience stood. I didn't see my parents there, and I didn't need to. Afterward, as I stepped off stage, a man approached me with a warm smile and a business card. His name was Michael Turner, one of the Foundation's senior advisors. He congratulated me on the annex's success and said they were considering us for a national grant. "Your model could be replicated across other communities," he said. "You've created something sustainable." We scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next month. When I got back to Charleston, I found Ryan working late in the lab. I told him about the opportunity, and he grinned. "Guess we're going national now." The pride in his voice wasn't envy. It was genuine joy. It reminded me of those childhood moments when I wished he'd see me not as competition, but as his sister. Now, finally, he did. The next few weeks moved fast. The foundation sent consultants to review our operations, and we began designing a proposal for expansion. Grandma visited often, her presence a steady reminder of why we'd started all this. On one visit, she handed me a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a framed photograph of Grandpa standing in front of the annex during construction decades earlier. He was younger, but his expression was the same calm determination I saw in the mirror every morning. "Keep it in your office," Grandma said. "He'd want to watch over what you've built." I hung the photo beside my desk, where the morning light hit it perfectly. Some days I caught myself glancing at it during long meetings or when decisions felt heavy. It reminded me that legacy wasn't about possession, it was about perseverance. Then one afternoon, as we were reviewing the final expansion proposal, Tara walked into my office holding her phone. "You should see this," she said quietly. She handed it to me, screen glowing with a news article. The headline read, "Robert and Diane Whitmore announce Family Trust Initiative, partnering with local foundations." My breath caught. The article featured a photo of my parents standing in front of a podium, talking about honoring family innovation. They'd used my name, the annex's name, and even included photos from our earlier press coverage. Ryan came in just as I finished reading. His face went pale. "They're using your work to rebuild their image," he said. I nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. They're claiming they helped fund the annex. I called the foundation immediately. Their communications director was already aware. We're investigating, she said. Don't worry, we know the truth, but it's causing noise online. The following days blurred together. Reporters reached out asking for comment, and false claims circulated that my parents had been instrumental in launching the annex. I stayed quiet publicly, just as our lawyer advised, but inside I felt something burning, a mix of betrayal and exhaustion. After years of silence, they'd found a way to turn my hard-won peace into their own publicity. Grandma called that evening, her tone calm but firm. They can't touch what's real, she said. Paper fades, truth doesn't. I closed my eyes, listening to the steadiness in her voice. Let the storm pass, Claire. You built this on integrity. It will stand. I hung up and looked around the annex at the students finishing their projects at Ryan, explaining code to a small group at Tara and Micah, laughing near the equipment bay. This was what mattered. This was what would last. That night, I drafted a single statement for the Foundation's press release. It was brief and clear. The Whitmore Research Annex remains an independent initiative founded on the vision of Henry Whitmore and carried forward by his descendants with transparency and purpose. It went public the next morning. Within days, the story turned. Reporters corrected their headlines, the Foundation reaffirmed its partnership, and the attention shifted back to our work. My parents went silent again, but I knew this wouldn't be the last time they tried to reclaim what they'd lost. Still, as I walked through the annex that evening, I felt something different: strength, not anger. The Foundation had invited me to speak again, this time in Washington. It would be the biggest platform yet, and I knew that standing there would mean more than any inheritance ever could. I locked the office and looked back once more at Grandpa's photograph glowing in the dusk. We're still building, I whispered. The morning of the Washington conference came with a nervous kind of stillness. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room, adjusting the lapel of my blazer, trying to steady my hands. The city outside was just waking up, horns in the distance, soft light breaking through low clouds. It had been almost a year since the will reading, and yet the memory of that room, my father's voice, and Grandma's steady defense felt like it had happened a lifetime ago. The Foundation's car picked me up at 8 sharp. As we drove past the marble steps of the Capitol, I tried to focus on the speech in my hand, though I'd already memorized every word. This time, I wasn't speaking as someone's daughter or someone's employee. I was speaking as the founder of something that had survived attempts to silence it. The auditorium was large, filled with faces from across the country: educators, entrepreneurs, researchers. I took a breath and walked on stage. The lights were bright, but I found comfort in their warmth. I started by sharing the story of the annex, not the inheritance fight, but the purpose behind it. I talked about how one unfinished dream became a place for others to start theirs, how mentorship wasn't about hierarchy, but about opening doors. The audience was quiet, attentive. When I finished, they stood, applause filling the room. Afterward, as I stepped off the stage, I saw Grandma standing near the exit, her silver hair glowing under the overhead lights. I hadn't known she would be there. She hugged me without a word, the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't. Your grandfather would have been proud, she whispered. And so am I. The Foundation announced later that afternoon that the annex had been selected for the National Innovation Award, an honor that came with additional funding for 5 new research partnerships. Cameras flashed, reporters gathered, and for once the story wasn't about family conflict or scandal. It was about progress. But peace, as I had learned, often made others restless. The following week, I returned to Charleston to find an envelope waiting in my mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, my father's, sharp and deliberate. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a single page on heavy stationery. The message was short. You may think you've won, but family legacy isn't yours to rewrite. I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer without replying. That night, Ryan called. They sent one to me too, he said. Same wording. His voice carried frustration, but underneath it I heard something else: resolve. We can't keep doing this, Claire. We can't keep reacting to their bitterness. He was right, so we didn't. Instead, we focused on our work. The annex began its expansion, welcoming students from 3 neighboring states. Tara and Micah led new labs, Ryan took on mentorship roles, and I oversaw development for the next phase of funding. The days were long but deeply fulfilling. Then one afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. I was in my office reviewing proposals when my assistant knocked softly. "There's a woman here asking for you," she said. "She says her name is Diane." My pen froze. I hadn't seen my mother in over a year. I told my assistant to let her in. When my mother stepped into the room, she looked smaller somehow, her posture less certain than I remembered. She held her purse close, glancing around at the space like she didn't know where to start. "You've done well," she said finally. Her voice carried both pride and distance. "It's impressive." "Thank you," I said evenly. She nodded, shifting her bag from one hand to the other. "Your father doesn't know I'm here," she added quietly. "He wouldn't approve." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I came to say that I'm sorry for how things turned out, for what we did at the will reading, for everything after." Her voice trembled slightly. "I thought I was protecting the family. I didn't realize I was breaking it." I listened without interrupting. There was truth in her words, but also the weight of too many years. "Mom," I said softly, "you can't undo what's already been done. But you can decide what happens next." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just needed to tell you that I see it now, the way we hurt you, the way we failed you." Before she left, she hesitated by the door. "Ryan called me last month," she said. "He's doing well. You both are." She gave a small, weary smile. "Maybe someday your father will understand too." When the door closed behind her, I sat for a long time, the air thick with something between grief and relief. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, the first one I'd ever received from her. That evening, I drove to Grandma's house. She listened quietly as I told her what had happened, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she said, "You gave her the chance to speak without closing the door. That's more grace than most people would manage." I stayed for dinner, helping her wash dishes afterward. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and lemon, the same scent that had filled my childhood summers. As I dried the last plate, she turned to me with a thoughtful look. "Do you know what I think your grandfather admired most about you?" she asked. "It wasn't your talent or your drive. It was your restraint. You never let cruelty turn you cruel." I didn't respond, but her words stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, the Annex's success grew. We signed the national partnership and launched a new mentorship scholarship in Grandpa's name. Ryan designed the website, and Tara created a plaque that read, "Legacy is not what we inherit, it's what we build." The dedication ceremony drew a small crowd, including local officials and several families whose children had benefited from our programs. When I stepped up to speak, the sight of all those faces, hopeful, determined, nearly stole my voice. After the ceremony, I walked down to the lake behind the annex. The water was still reflecting the sky like glass. Ryan joined me, skipping a small stone across the surface. "You think this is what he wanted?" he asked. I looked out across the water, thinking of Grandpa's letter, of Grandma's quiet strength, of every choice that had led us here. "I think it's what we all needed," I said. Ryan smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Then I guess we finally got it right." As we stood there in the fading light, I felt the old weight lift completely, the need to prove, to defend, to justify. What remained was steady and sure, something earned. When I returned to my office later that night, I found Grandma waiting by the entrance, leaning on her cane. "You left before I could give you this," she said, handing me a sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph of Grandpa standing in front of the nearly finished annex decades ago, smiling beside a younger version of her. On the back, in his familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words: "Keep going. You're not done." I traced the words with my thumb and smiled. It felt like he was still speaking, still guiding. The next morning, I placed the photo beside his old letter on my desk. Outside, students were arriving for orientation, their laughter echoing across the courtyard. I looked out the window and realized that somewhere along the way, justice had stopped looking like a battle. It had started to look like peace. But the story wasn't finished yet. There was still one more thing left to close the last thread that had kept us bound to the past. The morning I closed Grandpa's letter and looked out at the courtyard, I knew what I needed to do. The last loose thread wasn't about legal documents or ownership. It was about finding peace in what could never be fixed. For months, I'd avoided my parents completely. Every attempt they'd made to reclaim the past had been through control, never conversation. But as the annex grew, as life filled the space that once held silence, I realized avoidance wasn't the same as resolution. It was late spring when I finally made the drive back to the house where I grew up. The white shutters looked the same, but the yard felt smaller, almost fragile. I parked by the curb and sat for a while watching the curtains move in the front window. When I knocked, it was my father who opened the door. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders no longer squared, his voice lower, quieter. "Claire," he said. My name sounded strange in his mouth, like a word he hadn't used in a long time. Inside the house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, familiar and distant all at once. My mother sat in the living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't speak right away. I told them I wasn't there to reopen anything, only to set it down. "You don't have to understand what I've built," I said softly, "but you should know that I've found peace in it." My father stared at the floor for a long time before looking up. "Your grandmother called," he said. "She told us about the award, about everything you've done." He swallowed hard. "You made something out of the best of him." His tone wasn't pride, it was recognition stripped of ego. My mother's eyes were wet, but she stayed silent. For once, there was no argument to win, no lecture to deliver. Just the quiet truth that we were three people who'd hurt each other in different ways, each trying to live with the aftermath. Before I left, my father followed me to the porch. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I do hope one day you'll visit again." I nodded. Maybe I said. It wasn't a promise. It was a step. Driving away, I felt the strange relief of something heavy finally being put down. The ache was still there, but it had softened, reshaped into something I could carry without resentment. Grandma called that evening to ask how it went. I told her it was quiet but honest. "That's enough," she said. "Sometimes truth is the only closure you need." Summer arrived, and with it came the Annex's first full-year celebration. Students presented their projects under strings of lights we hung across the courtyard. Laughter carried into the night as parents, mentors, and sponsors mingled under the oak trees. Ryan stood beside me, pointing out his students' prototypes with the same pride he once envied in others. Grandma sat in the front row, a soft blanket over her knees, smiling at everything she saw. When it was my turn to speak, I looked at the crowd and thought of how far we'd come from that tense will reading in a law office to this open, light-filled space where hope had replaced bitterness. I thanked everyone for being part of what we'd built and reminded them that legacy isn't about inheritance, it's about intention. We don't get to choose how we're remembered, I said, but we do get to choose what we leave behind. After the applause faded, I joined Grandma on the bench near the fountain. Fireflies flickered through the air and the soft hum of conversation drifted around us. She squeezed my hand and said, "You found your place, dear, and you didn't lose yourself to get it." I rested my head against her shoulder and smiled. "I think I finally understand what Grandpa meant," I whispered. "You can't keep love by controlling it. You keep it by continuing it." It's been 2 years since that night. The Annex now runs 4 labs, 3 mentorship programs, and an outreach branch for rural students. Ryan teaches full-time and still sends me his syllabi for feedback, even though he doesn't need it anymore. Grandma visits often, always bringing lemon cookies and stories that make the interns laugh. As for my parents, we speak occasionally, mostly brief calls on holidays. It's not reconciliation, but it's peace, and that's enough. Some evenings when the halls are quiet and the lights dim, I walk past Grandpa's photo hanging by the main entrance. The brass plaque beneath it reads, "For those who build even when no one claps." I stop there sometimes listening to the echoes of footsteps and distant laughter, and realize that every painful chapter led here to a life rooted in purpose, not permission. If you've ever fought to be seen, if you've ever built something no one believed you could, I hope you remember this. Your worth isn't measured by who notices it. It's measured by what you create when no one's watching. And if this story stayed with you, take a moment to share it or just sit with it, because sometimes healing begins the moment you stop trying to prove yourself and simply choose to live as proof.